So hey there guys, Ishak from Shaktik here and welcome to episode 2 of So You Want to Take Some Photos. Today we're going to be looking specifically at our first manual settings, the Aperture. So this setting will help you take your photos to the next level, get a good foothold in taking photos with manual settings. So let's get into this. Alright, so let's take a look at lens. What is f-stop in terms of a technical point? F-stop is actually how much light your lens will allow through the aperture ring. So if, for example, here I'm twisting on this lens, we have a manual aperture ring. So what happens is when I twist this, you'll see the hole, which we call the aperture ring, gets smaller and bigger, meaning when we have a larger aperture, that means the hole is at its widest and we're getting the most light into our camera. But then when the aperture is at the smallest, we're getting the least amount of light into the camera. And essentially that's the basics of what aperture is. Aperture you'll normally see would be something called f-stop, is another way of seeing it. And usually an f-stop, you'll see it being like f over 1.4, f over 8. Essentially you can swap out the f for the number 1, and essentially, yeah, bigger the number, the wider the hole, smaller the number, smaller the hole, and the less light you're allowing into your camera. Lenses have limits on how far their aperture can open, and usually you'll see them labeled on the box or on the product themselves. The bigger the aperture number usually equates to the more expensive the lens is in most cases. This lens here, you can see it has a denotation of 1 over 1.4, which is actually the f1.4. So this is an example of a lens that can open up to quite a large aperture. An example of what playing around with the aperture can do, let me just show you in video form first. So right now at the moment we have it at the widest aperture setting this lens is able to do, which is f1.4. Now if I decrease the aperture, watch what happens to the image. You can see the image is getting a lot darker, getting very dark. And now we're at 8. And so if I turn it back to, I'm opening it up the aperture again, you can see the light comes flooding back in and we have a nice overexposed image. But yeah, that's an example of what it looks like on video. Now, another aspect of aperture here is I'll show you it when we're taking a photo. So we're going to be taking a picture of this beautiful Nikon F4. We're going to go to our camera and we're going to switch our mode to aperture priority. So most cameras, DSLRs, mirrorless cameras should have this setting. Then on your screen you'll notice the f2.8, f1.4, you'll see that setting on your main screen. Usually it's at the bottom, or if you're in some sort of dashboard view it should be there. To change it you usually have some sort of dial that you can crank left and right. Example, on the Sony camera we have a little dial that we can turn up and down the aperture. So yeah, we're just going to take a couple of shots at different aperture levels and then take a look at the images and compare and see the result. So this is our first photo we've taken. We've taken this as the widest that we could go on the lens. This is f1.4. Things to note when looking at this photo, you can see how much of depth of field we're getting. You can see the background is completely blurred. We're getting this nice look with the lights, a nice bokeh is what we would say with those lights, nice little circles, and everything looks creamy smooth in the background. You even notice that we have a little bit of blur around the edges of the camera itself. At this wide of an aperture you'll see that we're losing a little bit of detail on that, and the focus is just really being held quite close towards the camera. Now let's look at another photo which is at f13, and this is with much smaller aperture, and you'll see that there's a lot more detail in the photo. You can see all the objects in the background essentially. The lights are pretty much now fully, you're able to see the individual lights themselves. The camera itself, the body edge is much more crisp and sharp, and yeah, you can even see all the cameras in the background. So let's put the photos next to each other and so we can see the difference much more clearly. As you can see, of course, that depth of field is completely changed by the much wider aperture. You can see there's much more blur effect, and the image, the focus of the object seems to pop a bit more from the entire picture itself. You may be seeing a desire to have this kind of effect maybe in a portrait where you're trying to isolate someone's face in a photo and try and bring them out, for things such as product photography as well, where you're trying to distinguish one product out of everything in the lot. That would be really awesome to have a wide aperture. But there is also times and use cases when you want to have a smaller aperture. When you're doing landscape shots, for example, you want as much as you can in focus and sharp and you don't want to have a wide aperture, otherwise you're going to be struggling to gain focus on everything in your shot. So there you have it. That's Aperture for you guys. And so Aperture is a really awesome, simple manual setting that you can use when wanting to get that effect of bokeh, trying to try to really bring someone out in the image by getting the background as blurry as possible. One thing to know is sometimes though, when you go for some really high aperture settings, it can make it quite hard to nail focus. So it makes it hard in situations where you're trying to get fast objects, or even really large scale images where you're trying to pinpoint like someone in the crowd. That can be quite hard to do when you have such a large aperture on at the moment. But yeah, I really recommend, if you want to play around with this, some homework for you guys is go into your camera. If you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you will have a mode called Aperture Priority or something similar for your setting, where all you have to do is worry about aperture. All your other settings are taken care of. So yeah, go ahead, play around with that. Excited to see some results. Make sure to comment down below, maybe your Instagram or any links to some photos that you've taken. And also comment down below anything else you want to learn about photography, anything in specific, and we'll take it forward in this series. But as always, take care, Ibo1, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.